Thanks again for joining us, the Arsenal Performance Research Team online learning meetings. Today we've got Job Fransen joining us from Sydney, from Australia, but Job is Belgian. I'll let him introduce himself in a second. And as you know, or if you don't know, if it's first time logging in, the idea is we're doing a series of online education focusing around the isolation sort of restricted training period that we're in. So we've had from detraining, retraining, psychological, tendon loading, and we're going to have some different ones on nutrition and stuff coming up soon as well, and potentially some with athletes. So getting how they're dealing with this, because we're talking from our perspective as implementing and giving athletes programs, but I think we also need to hear from them. So hopefully we'll have that coming up soon as well. So today the topic is improving sport-specific skills during this period. We'll probably start a bit broad and then go into more examples. So Job is with the University of Technology of Sydney. He's an executive member of the Australasian Skill Acquisition Network, and he's a member of the Human Performance Research Centre at the UTS in Sydney. That's with Aaron Coates and Franklin Plitzeri, which I'm sure a lot of people know. Also a consultant and collaborator with various elite teams and organisations. He's also helped us and collaborated with us at Arsenal and on a number of projects, and continues to do so. So thanks for your help with us, Job. But I'll let you introduce yourself in more detail, and then I'll just jump into a few questions, see how we go.
All right, I'll do that really briefly. Hi, everyone. So my name's Job. What can I say about myself that's interesting for you? Well, I think I started out as a researcher more in the motor development space, around measuring motor competence or fundamental movement skills in children, moved towards the growth and development space around maturation, talent identification. And then now I think my most recent work is around decision-making and collective skill acquisition in team sports. So how do we learn together in the absence or presence of others?
Lovely. Thanks, Job. So just start off, because this is a skill acquisition is probably a less well-known term, certainly for me and for us in football, I think, although it's been all around for a long time. So I think it'd be good to maybe just start and give us an overview of what it actually is.
Yeah, so skill acquisition basically means motor learning, right? And motor learning is a term people are more familiar with, and that is, the study that describes how we learn motor skills over time and how that becomes an enduring capacity. So we borrow a lot of our terminology and thinking from fields like motor control, which describe how the central nervous system controls movement, but also a lot of it from exercise psychology or sports psychology, where we try to look at how do people make decisions, and once they make those decisions, how do they turn them into actions, etc. But we always look at it from the perspective of not of performance, what are we doing right now, but how can we make someone better in the long term over longer periods of time, and how can that become an enduring quality? And there's different types of skill acquisition. Obviously, you can have it sport specific, you can have it sport A specific. You can focus more on the perceptual component, or maybe more on the motor skill component. And there's all kinds of disciplines within skill acquisition. And skill acquisition has been around for a long time. And there's been some very famous skill acquisition specialists in the Australian Institute of Sports, for example. But it's not really a very prominent area worldwide, I would say, especially not in team sports. Very few would have skill acquisition specialists that they hire or consult with. It's usually the coach who's considered the skill acquisition specialist, rightfully so in many cases.
Yeah. So I guess for us in team sport anyway, the typical analogy, or the typical, what we say for performance, is complex and made up of technical, tactical, physical and mental qualities. So where do you see skill acquisition? Does it fit within that, or is it separate from that and adds to it? How would you see that?
Well, every scientist protecting or talking about their own discipline is going to say this, but I think skill acquisition is very foundational to all of these, right? If you want to be or physically, let's say, powerful, or you want to have good endurance, you have to first make sure that your central nervous system controls your muscles in an appropriate manner and that you move efficiently. Right? If we talk about tactical patterns, we're talking about things like pattern recognition, decision-making in the presence of others, which are all related to skill acquisition in some way. So in my perspective, skill acquisition really forms the foundation of many of these other aspects of performance and sort of has a leg in each one of them.
Can you give us some examples maybe of how, I guess I would be interested from a football perspective, but just whatever you're comfortable in, how that would actually look. So what the examples you've sort of said there, how does that look in those different domains or in a training session?
Yeah, so I can give you a concrete example. Something we've been working on a lot is we've been working at looking how players collaborate with each other through passing networks. So in other words, we look at, which are the most prominent players in passing networks and what happens when we make a substitution. Are those passing networks always the same over an entire game, or do they constantly change and fluctuate? And what we then do is we work together with a lot of performance analysts who crunch this really, valuable data for us. And then we use that to design training interventions that try and mimic what we actually do during a game at a collective level. So we're basically trying to train players to get used to being in the presence of others who are all making individual decisions, who all have, individual skill proficiencies, and we're trying to make them play more as a collective. Another example of skill acquisition at work is, if you have, let's say, someone who's returning from injury, oftentimes the movement pattern or the preferred movement pattern of that person has changed over time. So as you get them back returning from injury, often something you work on with them is to create or get back into those old and preferred movement patterns.
Yeah. So I guess is that, like you spoke a lot about collective. So is it something that should we be training this always as a collective, or can you train as an individual and then bring it in, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's where the interesting part comes. For the last, let's say last decade, I don't know, it could be more. I haven't been in this research field for that long. But let's say for the last decade, we've always been saying, well, if you want to train how to make good decisions and execute good actions in a team environment, you also have to train in that same context, right? You have to train with others present, teammates as well as opposition. So when we're talking about a team perspective and we're talking about really highly skilled athletes, the only way to train them is in the presence of others, whether that's teammates and or opposition, right? But when we're talking about less skilled individuals, many coaches would say, well, part of my training I spend on building foundational skills, right? Sometimes we refer to that as technique, movement patterns, right? How to kick a ball appropriately, how to pass and catch in rugby. And coaches actually spend a large proportion of their time on those types of training sessions with, more developing athletes. So yes, it's important to train in the presence of others, especially if you're highly skilled. But if you're not that skilled yet, there's obviously a big or a lot of importance in training that foundational capacity.
Yeah. And so you spoke also about specific skills there, like kicking or rugby, where that is, I'm guessing, more individual. Is that a separate thing that skill acquisition can also help, and it should be trained, and obviously something that can be done alone? And does it skills?
I think this is the ideal time probably to talk about what is the difference between technique and skill. Our technique is really, it's a sequence of movements. It's a coordination pattern, right? It's a way in which we perform a certain skill. And, when we see jugglers on the street, they're amazing. They've got amazing technique, amazing ball control to keep the ball exactly above the foot, right? But if we take those players and we put them in a sport-specific, let's say in a football-specific context, right, all of the sudden their really good technique is not really of benefit. And so there's a clear difference between technique, the movement sequence, and then a skill, performing that technique in a real world environment. And what we see there is that when you train technique, that can be really good. Having a good technique is really important. But there's a real difference between having technique or the right technique and being able to apply that in a context where you've got a decision that needs to be made in a split second and an appropriate action has to be executed based on that decision. So they are entirely different things. One is a foundational, more generic attribute, and skill is really a highly specific characteristic.
Yeah, thanks, Job. Just before we were talking, and you mentioned threshold theory. I don't know if this is a good time to lead into that or not, because I'm not fully understanding what it was, but if it sounds like it might be.
Yeah, it's definitely appropriate here. And the best way to explain it is, we all know that you need to have really good memory to be a chess player, right? That's pretty well established. But when we look at developing players who have better memory are probably better chess players at that time. But when you look at the really elite players, those differences in memory become a lot smaller all of a sudden, right? And that is referred to as threshold theory or the threshold hypothesis, which is certain generic qualities you need a certain amount of, but once you have more than the threshold, it doesn't actually help you with performing better. Again, being an ex-football coach, I'll try and explain it from a football perspective. If you've got really good dribbling technique, right? Or let's even call it dribbling skills. Those are really important, but at a certain level, right? Whether or not you are a really good dribbler or an exceptional dribbler doesn't really set you apart from your colleague experts anymore. So threshold theory is really a way to describe that generic abilities are very important for developing domain-specific expertise, but they're not the be-all and end-all.
Yeah. Thanks, Job. Can it be tested? Can we? Because we get a lot of companies and people trying to sell us the next talent identification tool. Find the next Messi or Ronaldo, and it's yourself. We spoke about it before. It's never that simple. Is this something that can be identified or not, or is it can? It's just difficult.
Yeah. So we've probably tested 15, 16,000 athletes in a talent identification space. And I can't really pinpoint one single predictor of future talent that we've ever consistently seen. However, there are things that we can pick up lower in that sort of threshold curve. So there are certain generic qualities that players might benefit from, things like, and we term it motor competence, the ability to perform a wide variety of motor actions. And we all know this as coaches, whether you're a coach in football or swimming or athletics. If you've got a good and efficient mover, they're usually going to be the ones who also have more sport-specific or domain-specific talents. All right, so we can pick up on these gifts that people have that are more generic, usually, and we've written a few studies or a few papers on that. Things like motor skill competence, you can pick up on that pretty quickly. But at the higher end, we haven't really found any, consistent measures that discriminate the absolute experts from non-experts. Of course, there are some, and there are isolated studies where they show, for example, that, elite players or elite athletes make faster decisions that are more accurate. That's fine, but they're not consistent predictors that we see across the board.
Good job. So I'm thinking, I'm always thinking back to that Borussia Dortmund, what's it called, the foot knot, I think, and you've done some work on that. Is that an example?
Yeah. So I'll quickly explain how that works. I did it I had a look at it, and we did some research with Adam Bevan in Hoffenheim. And basically what it is, it's a big cage, and you stand in the middle of the cage, and then an auditory and a visual cue sound, a gate opens up somewhere on the side of the cage. The ball gets dispensed from the gate. then you control the ball, and then you pass it again towards a visual and an auditory cue where another gate opens up, right? And at first sight, that's one of those assessments where we say, oh, wow, you know, that's got to be able to test exactly which players are our future prospects and which players are not. But when we looked at it in a reliability study, we saw that it actually only picks up on, you know, sort of age differences in that case at younger age levels, but never at older age levels. So we actually see that it's not a really good discriminating tool when the people who are already being tested inside the tool are already experts. And the reason for that is because when you make or when you execute a skill in, you know, in a football game or a rugby game or anywhere else, when you execute that skill, what you're basically doing is you're picking up information from the environment that's relevant, right? And then you're choosing the appropriate action. What you're doing in the foot burnout is you're reacting to a visual cue or an auditory cue, and then you're reacting by passing the ball as quickly as possible and as accurately as possible. But the perceptual information you're reacting to is actually not relevant to a football player at all. So that demonstrates how specific our assessments have to be if we really want to discriminate between absolute experts and those that are just below. And we see that consistently everywhere. I mean, we do quite a lot of research in esports players now, professional gamers, and they're some of the most expert individuals or domain-specific experts nowadays. They're people who've accumulated 8,000-9,000 hours of practice in just a few years, right? And even there, we can't pick up any differences between absolute elite performers and sub-elite performers with assessments that don't match the perceptual requirements and the action requirements of real competition. And if we only have one of the two, we can't actually pick up any expert differences.
Yeah, we spoke about that as well, about the actual testing. You're sort of saying it has to be very, very specific, but it also then becomes a lot more difficult. Is there anything that we should be, because there's so many companies and stuff on the internet and people trying to sell us these tests, is there any way for us to quickly pick out that it's probably not going to do what it says?
Yeah, I think a good general rule is, and again, there's some quite good studies. I think Steve Hadlow is a very good one if people want to refer to that. But I think if it lacks either the perceptual components of the sport that you're looking at using it in, or it lacks the action components, then it's definitely not going to be useful. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're a fencer, right? And someone tries to sell you equipment that has certain lights, and the lights pop up just like a choice reaction time task, and you've got to tap the lights. To me, there's no perceptual or perceptually relevant information. There's no other fencer which you would usually have in a competition scenario. Additionally, the action is not relevant if you're using your hands rather than, and I'm going to offend people, I'm going to say a sword, but it's probably called something different. But if it doesn't have a relevant action component or a relevant perceptual component, it's definitely not going to be relevant. And additionally, I would even say if it doesn't have both, I probably wouldn't even look at it nowadays. So it has to have, for me, it has to have both a real perceptual component and a real action component.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Rob. So I guess that's I think that's a good overview of, certainly for me, of a bit more background into skill acquisition. I'll remind everyone as well that we've got the chat, so if you want to pop in some questions, we'll get to them a bit, not too far away. But I thought just now is probably a good time to now go into more of the period that we're in just now. So first, I guess the first thing is what happens to the sports skills in this period? Do we lose them? Do athletes lose them? What kind of decline is there? Assuming that we do nothing, so we can talk after about what to do. But assuming we do nothing, what do we see? What can we expect? Like detraining?
Yeah. So the general idea that currently prevails in the skill acquisition literature is that if you are expertful, right? If you've trained for a very long time to develop a certain coordination pattern, a certain skill, a certain technique, then that is also very difficult to lose that, right? Because our body ultimately always wants to go back to the most efficient, most appropriate movement pattern, the most efficient coordination pattern. And if we've developed that over very long periods of time, it becomes really, really efficient. And it sort of becomes like something you always return back to. Where that's not the case is when you haven't had time to develop those really sound coordination patterns. And what could then happen if you don't train for a while is that ultimately they sort of degrade, right? And that coordination pattern slowly disappears. So it really depends on the level of the learner or the level of the performer.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess what the next logical thing is, what can we do in this period? So there's people are in different. So you've got people you've got athletes and us as well. It would be interesting. Some of us are in. We can get outside. We can kick a ball. We can dribble a ball. We can throw a ball or whatever it is. But others are in their homes without being able to leave. So we've got a whole range of people and athletes in their scenario, in their situations. So it'd be great to get some examples from kind of the top level to having almost nothing.
Yeah. So if we talk about, let's say, beginning to moderately advanced learners, to me personally, there's still really a lot of value in establishing the efficiency of those coordination patterns. Let's take again, kicking a ball, right? If you've got, whether it's a room or, you've got a piece of grass outside, or even you've got a wall, developing the efficiency in that kicking pattern, if it's not already well established, if you're a young learner, maybe a beginning player, or you're a more expert player, but you haven't done it for a very long time, right? Then there's real value in establishing that coordination pattern still. If you're a really advanced learner, it becomes a lot more difficult because really advanced learners have difficulties improving their skill in the absence of real world perceptual information or real world actions, right? And the one thing that we don't have if we're in isolation is we don't have others oftentimes. However, in that case, I've seen a really good example. One of my former supervisors once in a while posts some things on Facebook, and what he does, for example, with his child who also plays football, is I think they reenact some famous Belgian teams playing each other, right? So they're in the backyard and they're playing one-on-ones. And for that time being, that's all they have, but it's the most relevant perceptual and the most relevant action components that you can recreate. So more advanced learners have really got to go actually looking for someone. Hopefully they live close to someone, or they can at least work with someone. Beginning learners can really do a lot by themselves, work on those foundational skills, especially if they haven't reached that threshold yet, right? Because they can keep practicing, they get better, and it's only after that threshold that extra practice probably doesn't give you anything extra. So again, there's a difference between beginning learners and more advanced learners.
Yeah. And where the video games fit into anywhere?
That's difficult. And there are some studies out there, but that their results are not always as trustworthy. In my opinion, it's very difficult. And I have a lot of my friends have kids 8, 9, 10 years old, and they say, oh, my kid learns so much from FIFA. And I can kind of understand that, but I'm also quite certain they don't learn as much as they think they do, because ultimately FIFA is like a bird's eye perspective, right? First thing, if you're playing from a bird's eye perspective, the perceptual information is not real. If you're using your thumbs to control an avatar on the screen, the action component is also not real. Then you could say, all right, so what if I play first person view with a player from FIFA? Well, then I would say maybe that's a little bit better, but the way in which the players act in that environment is nowhere near similar to the way other players act. When we try to make decisions whether or not we should give a through pass really quickly, we do that because we see minute changes in the environment or minute changes in our optical flow. One player just cuts the corner a little bit quicker, and we know instinctively that that's where we've got to give the ball. Computerized avatars don't do that sort of thing. So computer gaming is probably a good excuse for parents to, let their kids game and feel fine with it. It's probably not the best training tool in these times.
Yeah, cheers, Job. So I guess when this period, kind of, we don't know, nobody knows when it's going to finish, when we're going to get back to training. But assuming we're going to decline a bit in this inabilities, when we come back to sport and to training, what would you recommend as a kind of to progress back in? Is there any risks for coming in, and should there be a safe progression? And how does the skill acquisition fit into that and benefit it?
Yeah, so the injury space is not my space whatsoever, but it does make sense to me that if you haven't trained for a while and those sort of coordination patterns degrade a little bit, that the very first time you go back out and you start kicking, and I think everyone who's had some sort of ankle fracture or some injury in the foot knows what that feels like, to come back from an injury and all of a sudden it feels weird to kick the ball. It feels weird to hold your leg in a certain way. The same thing with someone who's had a shoulder injury. All of a sudden it feels weird to stand on your hands again and control your center of gravity, right? And I think because we lose that efficiency in coordination patterns, we have to sort of slowly ease into it. However, for those of us who are experts or work with experts, those patterns are likely far less degraded after this period of rest. And basically, I think we can treat things like going back to normal, or we can basically go back to normal straight away. With more beginning athletes, I would say we ease into it a little bit more. Again, build that trust and build those, or the strength of those coordination patterns and the efficiency again before we move on to more complex aspects. And that can be, training these skills in isolation for a little while, maybe, and I've seen some really good documentation out there that was from the New Zealand Football Federation about how children, young people who are just engaged in football, how they can maintain, their skillfulness at home, so that once they get back to the field, they've actually still got, kind of those coordination patterns, and all they've got to train is how to make decisions, etc.
Yeah. So those New Zealand ones, we can probably, if people haven't seen them, we can maybe send that link. It's a free resource, isn't it? So we can probably send the next email to everyone as well.
It's very good, and you can see that's developed by someone who's got a bit of skill acquisition background as well.
Yeah. So one more question from me then. There's some questions coming through, Job. So we said at the beginning, it's not really that well established in many team sports. How would you sell it to the coach? Because you said the coach is also seen as the skill acquisition expert. So how do you sell it as complementing what they do rather than taking over from what? I guess that's an issue that you might come up against.
Yeah, I think there's two ways, or maybe three ways in which we can sell it. First, there's a lot of data out there that describes how we play, how we train, but very little people who understand how to put that into training exercises that actually improve players. Skill acquisition specialists are good at planning and structuring training. That's the first thing. The second thing is, what is hugely important when you're a skill acquisition specialist is to come over as non-threatening. You are not there to replace the coach. You are there to supplement whatever they are already doing, right? Usually it's a very slow and sometimes stagnant process. And then the last thing is, I think what's always a powerful sell for me is if you spend, a few $100,000 a year, I actually don't know how much it costs, but on monitoring and measuring physical fitness in players, if we could argue that in ways you can make these players more efficient, maybe by collaborating much better with the people around them, maybe by running more efficiently, maybe by making decisions quicker, right? If you've got a player who is, training day in, day out to become 0.2 seconds faster over 20 meters, why would you not train that player to make a decision faster because they pick up on relevant information quicker? So it's not because we're not a really established field. I think that we don't have relevance. but it is sometimes difficult to sell that relevance because we don't have the pedigree that a lot of other fields have. Plus, we're encroaching in the field of the coaches. And when I work in teams, often that is as a sort of adjunct coach, or I call it the coach's appendix. You're always running behind the coach and always sort of whispering in their ear or saying something left and right. And it's not in the coaching side of things, and it's definitely not in the sports science side of things. So it's somewhere in the middle.
Thanks, Job. So I'll jump onto questions. There's some questions coming through. First one here, are there any strong examples of skill acquisition tools being used in team sports which achieve both action and perceptual specificity?
Yes. People who are really good at designing small-sided games. So if you're very good at designing the constraints of small-sided games, you can come up with games that allow that exaggerate a movement problem, right? So it could be in a football perspective, right? If you want to players to play more with through balls, you might have a zone between the goal and the last defender where no defender can go, right? And someone has to then kick in one touch. That encourages players to exhibit the behavior you want them to exhibit. And you're doing that by coupling real world perception. You're playing a game with real action, which is the through ball. So in my perspective, if it comes down to training tools, and that's also why coaches are so important here, is really there's nothing better than well-designed training that invites players to exhibit the behavior that you want them to exhibit.
Yeah. So next question, efficiency of coordination patterns is interesting, but the context of ball kicking or golf driving must impact on the isolation period, even in the absence of other people. Is there any way we might create this spatial orientation during lockdown?
I'm not sure I follow the question.
So I'll say again, and then I'll try and interpret what I think it means as well. So efficiency of coordination patterns is interesting, but the context of ball kicking or golf driving must impact on this period. Is there any way which we might create this spatial orientation during lockdown? So I guess it's around training that skill in this period, even with minimal space. But obviously, you need a bit of space to be able to drive a golf. The golf club, or to really kick a ball.
Yeah, or you need some fancy equipment, one of those sheets that you can maybe hit golf balls against. And I mean, on the other hand, we also kind of have to admit that if we are going to lose some, if we are going to lose some of our technique maybe, or if we are going to lose some skillfulness, then that's just what it is. All we can do is try to maintain it as much as possible. And the end goal is always, you want to be good at kicking, kick a lot. You want to be really good at kicking, kick towards other people. You want to be extremely good at kicking, kick towards other people and goals, and do it in the right environment and do it based on the right, don't kick when you're far away from the goal, but kick when you're close enough so you can score. There's different levels in how we can train these abilities. If we don't have that equipment available, all we can do is, maintain with whatever we have.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that answered the question, but.
Yeah, we'll move on to the next one on virtual reality. For those sports without the bird's eye view, is this a benefit? So I'm assuming probably not many people will have access to virtual reality, or they may, but is that a benefit in lockdown?
Well, I've been very lucky because one of my best friends is a virtual reality game designer. So I've always been in this space, and he designs, computer games, things like Tag, right? And he designs it in open spaces. And the one thing he keeps telling me, which is something that resonates with what we know from skill acquisition science, is that if it's not 100% immersive, people who are very used at doing that task don't buy into it. So if you're playing a virtual opponent, and that virtual opponent might, in tennis, hit the ball back towards you, but they don't show any of the minute perceptual cues that you're used to anticipating on. For example, if someone serves, right, if you've played a certain player for a very long time, you can anticipate much better the direction in which they are going to serve. And you're doing that based on minute cues, perceptual cues that that person releases into the environment. If you don't have all that, then you can't really train expertise. It's again one of those tools that might be useful for really beginning learners, but I see very little benefit for actual experts or more advanced learners.
Thanks, Job. In your opinion, are there any appropriate assessment tools to measure athletes' visual perception qualities or decision making?
Yeah, so there's some lab-based studies that have been quite frequently used, and we use a lot of those as well, where you put eye trackers on a participant, and those eye trackers basically look where the selective visual attention goes. So they basically follow the eye, and they know where you're picking up the most pertinent source of information in the environment. And usually what these lab tasks do is they couple that measurement with some sort of sport-specific assessment. Again, if I go back to football, which has been used most commonly, you'd have the eye trackers on, you'd replicate some decision-making environment through video, and you'd make the player actually kick the ball or pass the ball or dribble the ball, and then you look at which information did that player pick up right before they made that decision. And there's quite a lot of decent lab-based tools. Of course, all of them have their criticisms, but we're definitely lacking in field-based tools. There's not that many. We're working on looking at, as a measure of skillfulness, we're looking at if players play, let's say, on a large field, moderate size field, and small field, which are the players who can consistently resist that change in constraints and continue to produce high outputs. And to us, theoretically, that makes sense. And that's maybe where these assessments are moving in the field, but there's actually not a lot of evidence out there at the moment. In lab-based tasks, yes. Field-based tasks, we're definitely missing quite a few components.
Which are the most important ones as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a question from someone with a swimming background. Obviously our athletes have no access to pools. As a sport that relies on flotation, feel and working with the water, can you advise anything we can do to support maintenance of aquatic skills?
That's a very difficult one because, and this person would know, but if you go back even 10, 20 years, when I had swimming, when I was going through my undergrad, we used to do a lot of dry swimming, but the dry swimming does almost nothing. It might, invite you to learn something about the coordination patterns that are relevant. But once you know how to swim, dry swimming has absolutely no purpose. So I'd say here, the best thing you can do is work with a conditioning specialist and at least make sure that the conditioning stays up to par. But if there's no pools available, there's not much you can do. You can maybe, use that opportunity. And this is the sort of teaching games for understanding or game sense approach, is you can use that opportunity to talk to your athletes about what are some of the tactical components that are important for swimming. What do we do in this scenario when someone's swimming alongside us, we're feeling very tired, and to just discuss those topics that might be things that you otherwise don't have time for. But I feel very bad disappointing you. There's probably not a lot you can do in terms of swimming without the pool, unfortunately.
Thanks, Job. So next one. What is your opinion on working with strobe glasses in a football context? Hoffenheim or Schalke use this in goalkeeping training, wide receivers for catching training, etc. Is there a benefit in order to improve visual perception and anticipation?
Yeah, so again, I think we're one of the only groups who've actually consistently worked with stroboscopic glasses and who have used them, well, now there's a few more, but who have used them in actual field tasks. And what we see is that when you put on strobe glasses, and this seems logical, right? If you decrease the amount of sensory information through the eyes that someone receives, their performance decreases. Now, the interesting thing that we see is that that performance decrement relatively is much greater in experts. So the way we see strobe glasses as a really good tool is in skills that require some sort of continuous visual monitoring, right? So something like dribbling skills, etc., to actually increase the difficulty of training by keeping the same coupling of the perceptual component and the action component. So you're still dribbling, the entire skill is still the same. You're just receiving less visual information. Now, where I see less relevance is, for example, in catching, right? If you're tracking a ball coming towards you, you know, the most important phases are early in the flight path of that ball and late in the flight path of that ball. The rest is used to position yourself somewhere. So it's not really that important. So in terms of goalkeeping training, also not really that relevant for the same reasons. But if we're talking about continuous skills where you continuously have to monitor visual information, use that to adapt the movements, then I think there's relevance in increasing the difficulty. And what we saw is when we used the strobe glasses in a recent study in the foot burnout at Hoffenheim, is we actually saw that we could artificially create much more difficult perceptual and action environments for these players. So even though they've got a tool that might not be 100% relevant at older ages, when you use those strobe glasses, you do sort of extend, I don't know if shelf life's a good idea, but you do extend the usability of that tool by, you know, creating it to be a little bit more difficult. So in my perspective, some relevance, but still to be proven whether that relevance also transfers later to competition or match play scenarios, which no one's tested before yet.
Yeah. So I think we've got the last question, and that takes us up to about the 45 minutes. Where is it? So what are some common mistakes? Are there any common mistakes that are made in training skills? Anything to kind of key things to look out for?
Yeah, I think I can talk about two things. Is one, as coaches, we love clean environments, things that don't look messy, right? And we like making sure that our players know at every single point in time what they're supposed to do. But what skill acquisition research is showing is that when you create more messy environments in which players have to emerge, or in which players' skills have to emerge from the mess, there's often a lot more value in that than in highly structured training. That's the first thing. So don't worry about your training session looking too clean, you know, not having any errors. It's actually good to have lots of errors, because ultimately skill acquisition is the ability to pick up on your own errors, detect them, and then correct them yourself. You want a performer who's able to learn from their own mistakes, if it were. And then the second thing, as coaches, something we often do is we use a lot of verbal instruction. But in a recent study, we saw that, for example, in one of those decision-making tasks in a lab with an eye tracker, if you give people tactical instructions and then ask them to make decisions, they will do whatever they can to appease those tactical instructions. So you're actually deliberately changing how people are making decisions. They're no longer making the best decision based on the environmental information that's there, but they're making the best decision based on what you told them previously. And I think those are two things that we can do. Don't over-instruct, and be okay with the messiness of your environments. And if people make mistakes, that's great. Encourage those mistakes, but encourage the learning from those mistakes as well. And oftentimes that has to be driven by the player or the athlete themselves.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you one more question from me. Well, it's actually from one of the first one we done with Inigo Mojica, I think, when we were talking about detraining. And let me know if it's not for you to answer. But it was just when you were saying there about the messy environments and making mistakes and stuff. And what somebody asked about, the players are very institutionalized. Everything's very structured, like you said. So it's, you come in 10 for 10:30, then you have this, then you're out on the field, then you're in here. And now we've come to a period where it's not like there's not necessarily a set program in place. And the question was more around, is this a bad thing? But from what you're saying, is that an opportunity maybe? Would you see that is there some opportunities in this as well?
Yes, but everyone who's worked in a high performance environment knows that that's an opportunity for some, but not for many. right? Some players will take initiative, and like the best coaches I've worked with, they've always given ownership to their players. They've always found it important that players make their own decisions, that they're responsible for their own learning, if that makes sense. But again, when a coach does it well, and at the end of a training session, they have a probing conversation and they ask elite players, you know, what happened here? What do you think we should do better here? There's always the same 5 who respond, and they would also be the same 5 who would benefit from this more messy scenario that we have right now, or the lack of structure, while the other, you know, 30, let's say in an Australian football context or more, might not benefit at all, or might not see it that same way. So yes, it is a learning opportunity for some, but probably not for most of them.
Yeah. And thanks, Job. One last question just came in, if you're all right to answer it.
Yeah.
So a training which focuses on decision making at the age 8 to 12, does it create nervous synapse specific? How long does it exist?
Yeah. So I think what this person is trying to ask is what happens, you know, because there's 2 things you can create when you do a lot of really specific tasks. You can create structural brain changes or functional brain changes. Structural brain change would be where, you know, one part of your brain might become larger, right? Functional brain change is something like training new synaptic connections. And anyone who's watching this Zoom, which I hope there still are by now, they would have had synaptic changes, right? They would have had new pathways develop as they watch this video. Their brain is not the same when they started watching it than when they end. So how important is training decision-making scenarios when you're young? It's quite important, but the specificity of those scenarios is probably not that important. What I would love to see in an 8-year-old or 9-year-old or 10-year-old athlete is not that they're extremely good at making decisions on a football field when they're a football player, but that they're really good at making good decisions in a 2-on-1 scenario when they're playing team handball, when they're playing water polo, etc. And I think so what I'm trying to say here is that yes, decision making's important at any age, but the specificity of those decisions towards the sport where maybe that player is migrating to, even though we don't know where they end up, doesn't have to be that specific at a younger age. And I think a generic understanding of the tactical components of invasion sports is much more important than knowing which decision to make when you're playing in a 4-3-3, when you're in that specific position at that particular time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's all the questions that are in, Job. Won't keep you any longer. I know it's a bit later there for you, but I really appreciate your time and coming on and chatting to us. And thanks everyone.
That was interesting.
Thanks, Job. Thanks everyone.